What if a nation was not a place but a weapon? What if a people had no stone cities to defend, no fields to plough, no graves to honor, making them eternally mobile, eternally hungry, and eternally at war? For the Romans and Goths of the late 4th century, this was not a philosophical riddle. It was the dust cloud on the eastern horizon, a cloud that blotted out the sun and smelled of burnt grass and terror. The first whispers came from spies and traders, men with haunted eyes who spoke of a people born and raised in the saddle, their legs bowed from a lifetime of riding. They said these nomads had no king, only a direction, west. Archaeologists centuries later would unearth Gothic treasures, gold and silver buried in a frantic hurry, but nearby they would find no bodies, no signs of a conventional battle, only the strange, unsettling hoofprints of a horse breed Europe had never seen. This was the first signature of the Huns, not conquest, but erasure. They were a people defined only by the future they devoured, arriving on the world stage from a past no one could trace. Rome had maps of every known land, from the misty shores of Britannia to the spice markets of India. But on those maps, there was a blank space, a vast, terrifying emptiness from which this storm had emerged. Civilizations build fortresses against men. They have no defense against a hurricane on horseback. The first to feel the full force of this storm were the Alans, a proud Sarmatian people whose heavy cavalry had been the terror of the Caucasus. On the banks of the Tanais River, they met the Huns. What followed was not a battle, it was a hunt. The Alan knights, encased in scale armor, charged with their long lances, expecting to break the lightly armored horsemen. Instead, the Huns simply evaporated, melting away like smoke. Then from all sides came the sound, a high, whistling hum that grew into a deafening shriek. It was the sound of tens of thousands of arrows, fired from uniquely powerful composite bows, a technology centuries ahead of its time. The arrows fell not like rain, but like hail, a storm of iron and bone that punched through armor and shattered shields. The Alans broke, their invincible cavalry scattered and annihilated. The Huns did not pursue with swords, they simply herded the fleeing warriors, firing endless volleys until the last Alan fell. The kingdom of the Alans, a power that had endured for generations, vanished from history in a single season. The few survivors became vassals, their cavalry now a tool in the hands of their conquerors. News of this annihilation traveled west, carried by panicked refugees. It reached the ears of Hermanaric, the aged king of the Greuthungi Goths, a warrior emperor whose domain stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. He was a figure of legend, a man who had crucified rival kings and ruled a vast confederation of tribes with an iron fist. He heard the stories of the Hunnic storm and scoffed. He was the master of the plains. He gathered his armies, confident that his Gothic warriors, tall and fierce, would crush these misshapen steppe dwellers. But the Huns did not fight the way Hermanaric understood. They did not meet his armies in a grand, heroic clash. They bled him. They raided his supply lines, burned his villages, ambushed his patrols. They were everywhere and nowhere at once. They turned his vast kingdom into a landscape of fear. His vassals, tribes held in check by his authority, saw his powerlessness and began to rebel. Hermanaric, faced with enemies from without and traitors from within, saw his life's work crumble into dust. The ancient chronicles say that the great king, unable to bear the shame of his defeat and the collapse of his empire, took his own life. The Gothic Empire, a northern behemoth that had troubled Rome for a century, had been broken not by a rival empire, but by a phantom. The terror was absolute. It was a fear born of the unknown. The Goths looked upon the Huns and did not see men. They saw something else. Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing from the safety of Antioch, recorded the descriptions that trickled back from the frontier. He wrote of a people so savage they ate their meat raw, tenderizing it by placing it between their thighs and the backs of their horses as they rode. He described their scarred faces, the result of a ritual in which the cheeks of male infants were cut with a sword so they would learn to endure pain before they tasted their mother's milk. Their clothes were stitched from the hides of field mice, worn until they disintegrated on their bodies. They were, in the Roman imagination, not quite human. They were a force of nature given monstrous form, a punishment sent by angry gods. An entire civilization, the Goths, a people of millions, was now in motion. They were not migrating, they were fleeing for their lives. The great wave of refugees, a human tide of terrified men, women, and children, surged westward, their eyes fixed on the distant, glittering line of a river that promised safety, a river that marked the border of the civilized world. They were running toward the Danube and toward the Roman Empire. What is more terrifying to a civilization, a known enemy you can fight, or an unknown horror you cannot even comprehend? Let the debate begin in the comments below. The banks of the Danube in the year 376 were a portrait of desperation. Tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands, of Tervingi Goths, led by their chieftain Fritigern, crowded the northern shore, their faces etched with the terror of the unseen enemy at their backs. They stretched out their hands across the swirling water, begging the Roman garrisons for asylum. They did not ask for land or for gold, they asked for life. They pleaded to be allowed into the empire as subjects, offering their young men as soldiers and promising eternal loyalty in exchange for refuge from the phantoms of the steppe. The Eastern Emperor, Valens, residing far away in Antioch, saw an opportunity. Here was a ready-made army, a source of manpower to replenish legions depleted by wars in the east. He agreed. But the crossing was to be managed by two local commanders, Lupicinus and Maximus, men whose greed was matched only by their cruelty. They saw not refugees, but a source of profit. The humanitarian crisis became a marketplace for human misery. Roman officials demanded the Goths surrender all their weapons, a humiliation for a warrior people. Then they began the extortion. They sold the starving Goths dog meat at the price of 1 child per dog. They took the sons and daughters of Gothic nobles as hostages and sold them into slavery. For weeks the Romans presided over this nightmare, growing rich on desperation, unaware that they were forging an enemy more dangerous than the one the Goths were fleeing. The breaking point came at a banquet in Marcianople. Lupicinus, in a show of Roman authority, invited the Gothic leaders Fritigern and Alavivus to a feast, while their people were kept penned in a camp outside the city walls, starving and surrounded by Roman soldiers. During the dinner, a scuffle broke out in the camp. Roman soldiers killed some of the Goths. Hearing the commotion, Lupicinus, in a drunken and arrogant rage, ordered his guards to murder the chieftain's entourage waiting outside the hall. Fritigern, realizing he was in a trap, convinced the Roman commander to let him go outside to calm his people. It was a fatal mistake on Lupicinus's part. Once outside, Fritigern was met not with a riot, but with the news of a massacre. The time for begging was over. He drew his sword and with a roar of fury declared war on the Roman Empire. The Gothic revolt had begun. It was not a planned invasion, it was an explosion of pure distilled rage. The starving, humiliated and betrayed refugees became an unstoppable army of vengeance. They were no longer seeking a home, they were seeking retribution. What followed was a storm of destruction across the rich provinces of Thrace. The Goths, now joined by their brethren the Gruthungi, who had crossed the Danube downstream, as well as disgruntled Roman miners and slaves who flocked to their banner, became a force of pure chaos. They burned villas, slaughtered landowners, and plundered cities that had stood secure for centuries. They now had weapons, Roman weapons, taken from the garrisons they overran. And they had a purpose. They were fueled by a righteous fury that Roman legionaries fighting for pay and orders could not comprehend. Emperor Valens, hearing of the disaster, was incensed. He broke off his campaign against the Persians and marched his elite field army from the east to deal with the Gothic problem personally. He was arrogant, impetuous, and dangerously overconfident. His nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, was marching to his aid with reinforcements, but Valens wanted the glory of victory for himself. He listened to sycophants who told him the Goths were a disorganized rabble that would break at the first sight of the imperial eagles. He ignored his own scouts who warned him of the enemy's vast numbers and desperate ferocity. Rome did not fall to the Goths. It drowned in the tears of the refugees it had created. On the 9th of August, in the year 378, near the city of Adrianople, the Roman army met the Gothic host. It was a sweltering summer day. Valens, eager for battle, marched his men for 8 miles under the blazing sun without rest or water. They arrived before the Gothic wagon laager, tired, thirsty, and disorganized. The battle began chaotically. As the Roman infantry engaged the Goths defending their fortified circle of wagons, the Gothic cavalry, which had been away foraging, suddenly returned. They crashed into the exposed Roman left flank like a thunderbolt. The Roman cavalry, caught by surprise, was shattered and fled. The legionaries were now surrounded, pressed together so tightly they could not even draw their swords. The slaughter began. It was not a battle anymore. It was an extermination. The elite soldiers of the Eastern Roman Empire, the veterans of dozens of campaigns, were cut down where they stood. 2/3 of the army was annihilated. Dozens of high-ranking commanders were killed. And somewhere in the chaos of dust, blood, and screaming men, the Emperor Valens, master of half the world, disappeared. Some say he was struck by an arrow and died on the field. Others tell a more gruesome tale, that he was wounded and carried to a nearby farmhouse, which the Goths, not knowing who was inside, simply burned to the ground. The emperor's body was never found. The Battle of Adrianople was more than a defeat. It was an apocalypse. It was the worst military disaster Rome had suffered in nearly 400 years since the forests of Teutoburg. The heart of the empire's army had been ripped out. The Balkans were now a wasteland, open and defenseless. The Goths were masters of the field, but they were not the true victors. Far to the east, in their new camps along the Danube, the Huns watched. They had not fired a single arrow, yet they had brought the Roman Empire to its knees. They had learned a valuable lesson: the Colossus could be bled. And they knew its blood was not iron, but gold. The shock of Adrianople reverberated across the Roman world. An emperor was dead, an army erased. The Goths, though victorious, were a raging fire without a direction. They roamed the Balkans, but they could not take the great walled cities. A new emperor in the east, the brilliant general Theodosius, eventually pacified them not through battle, but through diplomacy, settling them within the empire's borders as federates. The immediate crisis seemed to pass, but the true danger had not. The Huns, the silent architects of the disaster, had moved into the vacuum. They crossed the Danube and settled in the vast plains of Pannonia, the land that would one day be called Hungary. From here, they could strike west into Italy or east into the Balkans with equal ease. They were no longer a distant rumor from the steppes. They were a dagger pointed at the heart of both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. Their leaders, chieftains like Uldin and Rua, were shrewd and observant. They had seen how the Goths had shattered a Roman army, but they had also seen how Rome, even in its weakness, could absorb and neutralize a people through treaties and land grants. The Huns would not make that mistake. They did not want to become part of the Roman world. They wanted the Roman world to become their personal treasury. Thus began a new era in the relationship between the empire and the barbarians. It was an age not of conquest but of extortion. The Huns pioneered a new form of warfare, geopolitical blackmail. Why risk your warriors in bloody battles when a simple threat would suffice? Uldin was the first to perfect this art. When a group of Goths who had served Rome fled to his territory, the Romans demanded their return. Uldin, standing on the banks of the Danube, simply pointed to the rising sun and declared, "Wherever the sun shines, I can conquer." The Romans, with the memory of Adrianople still fresh, understood the message. They backed down, the Huns had become the arbiters of the frontier. The flow of gold began as a trickle, then became a stream, and finally a river. The Eastern Roman Empire, under constant pressure from Persia, found it cheaper to pay the Huns off than to fight them. They agreed to an annual tribute, a payment of 350 pounds of gold in exchange for peace. It was a humiliating precedent. When an empire starts buying peace, it is no longer an empire, it is a treasury waiting to be emptied. The reign of Rua, Uldin's successor, saw this system of tribute refined into an instrument of absolute control. The annual payment was no longer just for peace, it was for everything. If Roman merchants were captured, they were ransomed at exorbitant prices. If rival tribes sought refuge in Roman territory, the Huns demanded they be handed over, or the price of peace would rise. Roman ambassadors, men from noble senatorial families, were forced to travel to the primitive Hunnic camps in Pannonia to negotiate. These were not meetings of equals. The Roman envoys, dressed in silk and accompanied by a retinue of servants, would be kept waiting for days, exposed to the elements, before being granted an audience. The Hunnic chieftain, seated on a simple wooden stool surrounded by his warriors, would treat the representatives of the Caesars with open contempt. He would dictate terms, not discuss them. The Romans were forced to listen, to agree, and to pay. The humiliation was immense, but the alternative was a Hunnic invasion, a prospect too terrible to contemplate. This river of gold had a profound effect on Hunnic society. They were no longer just a nomadic horde, they were becoming a shadow empire, a parasitic state that fed on the wealth of its civilized neighbors. The gold was used to cement the loyalty of vassal tribes, the remnants of the Alans, the Goths, the Gepids, and dozens of others who were now subjects of the Huns. It bought them the finest weapons, the best horses, and the unwavering allegiance of their warriors. Ironically, it also bought them a place within the Roman system. The Romans, desperate for elite soldiers, began hiring Hunnic mercenaries. Hunnic horsemen served as bodyguards for Roman generals. They fought in Rome's civil wars, sometimes on both sides. The great Roman general Attila, who would later become their greatest adversary, spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and learned their ways, using Hunnic armies to secure his own power in the Western Empire. It was a bizarre, symbiotic relationship. The Romans were paying the Huns not to attack them, while also paying them to fight their other enemies. The system was corrupt, unsustainable, and utterly humiliating, but it kept the peace for now. But the endless flow of gold did not satisfy the Huns. It only whetted their appetite. It created a hunger for something more than wealth. It bred a new generation of leaders who understood that gold was merely a tool. True power did not come from tribute, but from the absolute terror that compelled emperors to pay it. This was the world inherited by two brothers, the nephews of Rua. Their names were Bleda and Attila. The two brothers, Bleda and Attila, inherited a fearsome legacy and a well-oiled machine of extortion. Together, they ruled the vast confederation of tribes their uncle Rua had forged. Their first major act was to renegotiate the terms of peace with the Eastern Roman Empire. At the city of Margus on the banks of the Danube, they met the Roman ambassadors. In a display of calculated dominance, the Hunnic kings refused to dismount from their horses, forcing the Roman envoys to conduct the entire negotiation on foot, looking up at them. The resulting treaty was a masterpiece of humiliation for Constantinople. The annual tribute was doubled from 350 to 700 pounds of gold. Roman markets were to be opened to Hunnic traders. And most critically, the Romans were forbidden from ever again giving refuge to any tribe or individual fleeing Hunnic rule. The empire was now officially a vassal state in all but name, its foreign policy dictated from a Hunnic saddle. For a time, this arrangement held. Bleda, the elder brother, seemed content with this life of subsidized raiding and diplomatic dominance. But Attila was different. He was possessed by a colder, far greater ambition. He saw the gold not as an end, but as a means. He watched the Romans with their endless intrigues, their sophisticated lies, their decadent cities, and he felt nothing but contempt. The relationship between the two brothers grew strained. The historical sources are silent on the details, but they paint a picture of two contrasting personalities. Bleda was perhaps more traditional, a chieftain content with the nomadic lifestyle of his ancestors. Attila was a visionary, a politician, a man who saw the potential to forge the Hunnic horde into a true empire, a power that could challenge Rome not just for gold, but for the world itself. Such a vision had no room for a co-ruler. In the year 445, the partnership came to a sudden and brutal end. The official story, as recorded by the Romans, is sparse. Bleda died during a hunt, but no one, then or now, truly believed it was an accident. Attila, it was whispered, had arranged for his brother's death, eliminating his only rival to become the sole master of the Huns. With Bleda gone, Attila moved with terrifying speed and purpose. He purged his brother's loyalists and centralized all power in his own hands. He was no longer just a chieftain, he was an emperor, the absolute monarch of a vast, multinational army composed of Huns, Goths, Alans, Gepids, and a dozen other subjugated peoples. He was a brilliant organizer, a master of logistics, and a ruthless disciplinarian who held his chaotic empire together through sheer force of will. To legitimize his rule and inspire his followers, he cultivated a powerful myth. The legend began to spread of the Sword of Mars, the sacred weapon of the ancient Scythian god of war. A herdsman, the story went, noticed one of his heifers limping. Following a trail of blood, he found a magnificent ancient sword protruding from the earth. Realizing its divine origin, he brought it directly to Attila. Attila accepted it as a sign from the heavens. He now possessed the very weapon of the war god. His conquests were not just his will, they were a divine mandate. He was destined to rule the world. He consciously began to build his own fearsome reputation. He lived a simple, austere life, eating from a wooden plate and drinking from a wooden cup, even as his lieutenants feasted from gold and silver. This was not humility. It was a carefully crafted image of a man above mortal temptation, a man concerned only with war and power. The Romans, desperate to understand the man who held them in his thrall, called him the Flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. It was a name meant to inspire fear, to cast him as a divine punishment for the sins of mankind. Attila heard the name, and he embraced it. A king needs a crown and a throne, but a force of nature needs only a weapon and the fear of those in its path. With his brother dead and a divine sword in his hand, Attila, the sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire, was ready. The years of collecting gold were over. The era of burning cities was about to begin. He turned his gaze south towards the rich, complacent, and terrified provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire. Was Attila a ruthless fratricide who murdered his own blood for absolute power, or a cold pragmatist who removed a fatal weakness to forge his people into a force destined for greatness? Cast your vote in the comments. The pretext for war, when it came, was almost laughably thin. A bishop from the Roman city of Margus, the very place where Attila had humiliated the empire's diplomats, had crossed the Danube and desecrated some Hunnic royal tombs, stealing their treasures. Attila demanded the bishop be handed over. The Romans refused. It was all the justification Attila needed. In the spring of 441, the storm broke over the Balkans. This was not a raid for plunder. This was a war of annihilation. Attila's army, a vast and disciplined host, poured across the Danube. They were no longer just a horde of horse archers. Under Attila's command, they had become masters of siege warfare, using captured Roman engineers to build battering rams, siege towers, and massive catapults. The first city to fall was Viminacium, a major military base. It was razed to the ground, its population slaughtered or enslaved. Then came Margus itself. In an act of ultimate betrayal, the very bishop who had caused the war secretly opened the city gates to the Huns in exchange for his own life. The city was sacked and burned. The invasion rolled on, a tide of fire and death. Singadunum, the city that would one day be Belgrade, was taken. Then Serdica, modern Sofia. The Roman field armies sent to stop them were not just defeated, they were obliterated in a series of lightning battles. Attila's speed and brutality were unlike anything the Romans had ever faced. The climax of the campaign was the siege of Naissus, the birthplace of Constantine the Great, one of the empire's most revered figures. Naissus was a large, wealthy, and heavily fortified city, a symbol of Roman power in the Balkans. Its inhabitants trusted in their high walls, but Attila's army was relentless. For days, they battered the walls with immense rams and pounded the defenses with projectiles. Finally, the walls were breached. The Huns poured into the city like a flood. The slaughter was immense. Years later, the Roman ambassador Priscus of Panium passed through the ruins of Naissus on his way to Attila's court. He wrote a chilling account of what he saw. The city was completely deserted. The riverbanks were lined with human bones. The only living souls he found were a few sick people huddled in the ruins of the churches. He had to camp outside the walls because the stench of death was still too strong. It was a vision of the apocalypse, a testament to the totality of Hunnic warfare. Attila did not just conquer cities, he erased them from the map, leaving behind only bones and ashes as a warning to others. The terror reached the gates of Constantinople itself. The great Theodosian walls, the most formidable fortifications in the world, were the only thing that stood between Attila and the capital of the Eastern Empire. The population was in a panic. An earthquake had recently damaged a section of the walls, and the people worked frantically day and night to repair the breach before the Hunnic horde arrived. Attila's army ravaged the territory right up to the city, but he did not attempt a direct assault. Perhaps he knew that even his army could not take those walls. Perhaps he did not need to. The psychological victory was already his. He had burned the empire's heartland, destroyed its armies, and now stood at its gates. The Emperor Theodosius II had no choice but to sue for peace. The terms were crushing. The annual tribute was tripled, rising to an astronomical £2,100 of gold per year. An immediate payment of £6,000 of gold was demanded to cover arrears. All Hunnic deserters were to be returned, and a vast no-man's land was to be established south of the Danube, effectively ceding a huge swath of Roman territory to the Huns. It was a complete and utter capitulation. Attila had achieved his goal. He had broken the will of the Eastern Empire and turned it into his personal bank. He returned north to his great camp on the plains of Pannonia, a sprawling city of wood and tents, to enjoy the fruits of his victory. Here he ruled as an emperor. Priscus, the same man who saw the ruins of Naissus, later visited Attila's headquarters as part of a diplomatic mission and left a priceless, detailed account of the Hunnic court. He described Attila not as a raging savage, but as a sober, imposing, and utterly confident ruler. While his lieutenants drank from golden goblets, Attila used a simple wooden cup. He was surrounded by wealth, but personally untouched by it. He was a master of psychological theatre, a man who understood power on a primal level. He had brought one half of the Roman world to its knees. Now his gaze, cold and calculating, began to turn west. He looked towards Gaul and Italy, towards the crumbling Western Roman Empire, and its de facto ruler, the general Flavius Aetius, a man who had once been his friend. The stage was being set for an even greater conflict, a clash that would decide the fate not just of an empire, but of a civilization. The long and complicated relationship between Attila and Flavius Aetius was about to enter its final bloody chapter. Aetius, known as the last of the Romans, was a man who understood the Huns better than anyone. He had spent his youth as a hostage at their court, learning their language and their ways of war. He had used Hunnic mercenaries to climb the treacherous ladder of Roman politics, securing his position as the supreme commander of the Western Empire's armies. For years, a tense understanding existed between the two men, but Attila's ambition was limitless. He needed a pretext to invade the West, and he found it in a bizarre and desperate plea from a Roman princess. Honoria, the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, was a woman of ambition trapped in the gilded cage of the imperial court. To escape a forced marriage, she sent a message and her signet ring to Attila, begging him to rescue her. Attila, in a brilliant stroke of political theatre, chose to interpret this as a proposal of marriage. He claimed Honoria as his bride and demanded half of the Western Roman Empire as her dowry. The demand was, of course, rejected. Attila now had his cause for war. In the spring of 451, Attila gathered the largest army the world had ever seen. His own Hunnic warriors formed the core, but they were joined by vast contingents from the peoples he had conquered: Ostrogoths, Gepids, Heruli, Syri, and many others. It was a rolling tide of nations, an immense host that poured across the Rhine and into Gaul. Their advance was terrifying. Cities were burned, populations massacred. Metz was razed to the ground, its inhabitants slaughtered in the church where they had sought refuge. The Huns moved on Paris, but according to legend, the city was saved by the prayers of Saint Genevieve. Their true target was Aurelianum, modern-day Orleans. Its capture would give Attila a strategic crossing over the Loire River, opening the way to the Visigothic kingdom in the south of Gaul. As Attila laid siege to Orleans, Aetius scrambled to assemble an army to stop him. It was a near impossible task. The Western Roman army was a shadow of its former self. Aetius knew he could not face Attila alone. He had to forge an alliance with his own traditional enemies. He rode to the court of Theodoric I, the aging king of the Visigoths, the very people who had sacked Rome 4 decades earlier. He convinced Theodoric that Attila was a threat to all, Goth and Roman alike. In an unprecedented turn of events, the ancient enemies united. They were joined by the Franks, the Burgundians, and the Alans. It was a coalition of strange bedfellows, a patchwork army of rivals and foes, united only by their shared terror of the scourge of God. The allied army marched to relieve Orleans just as the city was about to fall. Attila, not wanting to be trapped with a river at his back, withdrew eastward, searching for a place to give battle. He found it on the Catalonian plains, a vast open expanse near modern-day Châlons-en-Champagne in France. It was here, on this wide, flat ground, that the fate of Western civilization would be decided. The two armies that faced each other were a mosaic of the entire late antique world. On one side, Attila and his Huns stood at the center, flanked by their German vassals. On the other, Aetius and his Romans held one flank, while Theodoric and his Visigoths held the other. In the center, Aetius placed the unreliable Alans, hoping to pin them between the Romans and Goths so they could not flee. The numbers are impossible to know for certain, but ancient historians speak of hundreds of thousands of men on each side. It was, without a doubt, one of the largest and most consequential battles in human history. It was not a battle for territory, it was a battle for survival. A single day would determine whether Europe's future would be Roman and Germanic or Hunnic. The battle, which took place on the 20th of June, was a scene of unimaginable carnage. It began with a struggle for a ridge that overlooked the plain. The Allies managed to seize it first, giving them a crucial advantage. Then Attila launched his main assault. The Huns surged forward in a massive cavalry charge, crashing into the Allied center. The Alans broke, as Aetius had feared, but the Roman infantry and the Visigothic warriors held firm. The fighting was savage, a swirling melee of desperate, close-quarters combat. In the chaos, the Visigothic king Theodoric was thrown from his horse and trampled to death by his own charging men, but his son Thorismund, seeing his father fall, led the Goths in a furious charge of revenge. They drove back the Ostrogoths on Attila's left flank and began to encircle the Hunnic center. For the first time in his life, Attila was in danger of being defeated and captured. He retreated to his camp, a lager of wagons, and prepared for a last stand. He had a great pyre of wooden saddles built, ready to throw himself into the flames rather than be taken alive. But the Allied victory was not complete. Aetius, ever the pragmatist, made a calculated decision. He feared that if the Hunnic threat were completely eliminated, the now powerful Visigoths would become an even greater danger to Rome. He convinced Thorismund to return to his capital of Toulouse to secure his throne before his brothers could usurp it. The Visigoths withdrew. The battle was over. It was not a clear victory for anyone. It was a bloodbath that had bled both sides white. Attila was stopped but not destroyed. The field was littered with the bodies of, according to one chronicler, 165,000 men. The greatest invasion of Gaul had been halted, but the scourge of God was still alive, and now he was burning with a desire for revenge. Attila was not a man to accept defeat. The stalemate on the Catalonian plains had been a humiliation, a check on his aura of invincibility. In the spring of 452, he returned, this time striking at the very heart of the Western Empire, Italy. He gathered his forces and crossed the Julian Alps, descending into the rich plains of the Po Valley. The first major city in his path was Aquileia, a wealthy port and a formidable fortress. Its citizens resisted fiercely. The siege was long and difficult, and the Hunnic army, unaccustomed to such stubborn opposition, began to grumble. Attila's own leadership was questioned, but as he rode around the city walls contemplating retreat, legend says he saw storks carrying their young out of the city from their nests in the towers. He interpreted this as an omen that the city would fall. He ordered a final, massive assault. The walls were breached, and the Huns poured in. Their vengeance for the long siege was terrible. They sacked the city so completely and burned it so thoroughly that a half-century later it was difficult to determine where it had even stood. The survivors fled into the nearby marshlands, where they founded a settlement that would one day become the city of Venice. The fall of Aquileia sent a shockwave of terror through Italy. City after city, Padua, Vicenza, Verona, Milan, surrendered without a fight, opening their gates in the hope of avoiding Aquileia's fate. Attila marched through northern Italy, his army plundering at will. In Milan, the imperial residence, he entered the palace and saw a painting depicting the Roman Caesars on their thrones, with Scythian chieftains lying dead at their feet. In a display of grim humor, he ordered a painter to be found and had the scene repainted, showing Attila on the throne with the Roman emperors emptying bags of gold at his feet. The road to Rome, the ancient capital of the world, was now open. Panic gripped the Eternal City. The emperor, Valentinian III, a weak and ineffectual ruler, fled from his court in Ravenna to the safety of Rome, only to contemplate fleeing Italy altogether. The Roman army, shattered at the Catalonian plains, was in no condition to face Attila again. It seemed nothing could stop the scourge of God from sacking the city that had once ruled the world. There was a belief that Rome was invincible, yet the memory of its sack by the Goths in 410 was still fresh. Rome had run out of generals and armies. It had only one weapon left: faith. In a desperate last-ditch effort, an embassy was sent from Rome to plead with the Hunnic king. It was a strange delegation, composed of 2 high-ranking senators, and most remarkably, the Bishop of Rome, a man named Leo. This was before the popes of the Middle Ages held temporal power. Leo was a spiritual leader, not a prince. The meeting took place on the banks of the Mincio River in northern Italy. The scene is one of history's most dramatic and mysterious encounters. On one side stood Attila, the most feared warrior on earth, at the head of an invincible army, with the wealth of Italy at his feet. On the other stood an old, unarmed priest, backed only by his faith and the moral authority of his office. The details of their conversation are unknown. They spoke in private. But what happened next has been debated for centuries. Attila, the man who had burned his way across Europe, the man who stood on the verge of his greatest triumph, turned his army around and left Italy. Why? The Christian tradition, of course, credits Pope Leo with a miracle. It is said he was accompanied by the spectral figures of St. Peter and St. Paul, who threatened Attila with divine retribution if he harmed the city. But historians look for more earthly explanations. Attila's army was suffering from a plague that had broken out in the Italian summer. His supply lines were stretched thin. Furthermore, the Eastern Roman Emperor Marcian had launched an attack across the Danube, threatening the Hunnic heartlands. And perhaps Attila also remembered the fate of Alaric, the Visigoth who had sacked Rome in 410 and died mysteriously shortly thereafter. Perhaps he feared the curse that seemed to fall upon any who violated the Eternal City. We will never know for certain. It was a clash not of swords but of wills, a moment where the brutal logic of power met a force it could not comprehend. Why do you believe Attila spared Rome? Was it a divine miracle as the legends claim, or a calculated political move by a leader facing disease and a second front? Share your theory below. Attila retreated from Italy, his ambitions checked, but his power unbroken. He returned to his great encampment in Pannonia, threatening to return and destroy Italy if the Emperor Valentinian did not send him his promised bride, Honoria. He was still the most powerful man in the world, the master of an empire stretching from the Rhine to the Caspian Sea. In the year 453, he decided to take another wife, a beautiful Gothic princess named Ildiko. A great feast was held to celebrate the wedding. Attila, contrary to his usual sober habits, drank heavily, celebrating late into the night. He retired to his wedding tent with his new bride. The next morning, his attendants grew concerned when he did not appear. After shouting his name and receiving no response, they broke down the door. They found a scene of shocking, anticlimactic horror. The bride, Ildiko, was weeping hysterically by the bed. And on the bed lay Attila, the scourge of God, the terror of the world, dead. There was no wound on his body. He lay in a pool of blood, having apparently suffered a severe nosebleed in his drunken sleep and choked to death. The most feared warrior on the planet had been vanquished not by a Roman legion or a Gothic assassin, but by a burst blood vessel. The official story was death by natural, if undignified, causes, but rumors swirled immediately. Had he been murdered? Was the terrified bride Ildiko a willing or unwilling assassin, avenging her people for the decades of suffering the Huns had inflicted upon them? Or was it a more complex political assassination, orchestrated by one of his rivals or even by the Romans? The truth was buried with him. The grief of the Huns was terrifying in its intensity. His warriors cut their faces and shaved their heads, mourning their great leader, not with tears, but with their own blood. They believed that the greatest of all warriors should be mourned with no feminine lamentations, but with the blood of men. His funeral was as secretive and legendary as his life. He was buried in a triple coffin, the innermost of gold, a second of silver, and the outermost of iron. The gold and silver symbolized the tribute he had wrung from the empires. The iron symbolized his conquests. The treasures taken in his wars were buried with him. And to keep the location of his grave a secret forever, the slaves who had dug the tomb were all put to death. The grave of Attila has never been found. The death of the king was the death of the empire. Attila's vast domain had been held together by one thing alone, his personal genius and the sheer terror he inspired. He had many sons, but none of them possessed his strength, his cunning, or his vision. They immediately began to quarrel over their inheritance, seeking to divide the empire and its subject peoples among themselves like a private estate. Elak, the eldest and favored son, Dengizic and Ernak all vied for supremacy. The subject peoples, the Goths, the Gepids, the Heruli, and others who had followed Attila out of fear, saw their opportunity. They had been vassals, but they had never forgotten that they were once proud warrior nations. The awe that had bound them to the Huns died with Attila. An empire built on the will of one man cannot survive him, for when the man is gone, only the fear remains, and fear without a focus quickly turns to rebellion. The great Hunnic Empire, which had held the world in its grip, began to crumble from within, a process that would be as swift and catastrophic as its rise. The rebellion was led by Ardaric, king of the Gepids. He had been one of Attila's most loyal and trusted counselors, a man who had fought alongside the Huns on the Catalonian plains. But with Attila gone, his loyalty was to his own people. He forged a confederation of Germanic tribes, uniting yesterday's vassals in a common cause: freedom. The sons of Attila, led by the eldest Ellac, gathered their remaining loyal forces to crush the uprising. In the year 454, just 1 year after Attila's death, the two armies met in Pannonia, near the unidentified Nedao River. The battle that followed was a desperate, furious struggle. It was a war of liberation, fought with a ferocity that matched any of Attila's own campaigns. The Germanic warriors, fighting for their freedom, threw themselves against the Hunnic lines. The Ostrogoths, in a particularly dramatic moment, turned on their former masters, eager to avenge decades of servitude. The battle was a complete disaster for the Huns. Their army was shattered. Attila's favorite son, Ellac, was killed in the fighting. The spell of Hunnic invincibility was broken forever. The masters of Europe were now fugitives. The collapse was total and swift. The surviving sons of Attila led the remnants of the Hunnic people eastward, retreating back towards the Black Sea, steppes from whence their grandfathers had come. The great center of power in Pannonia, which had been the terror of the world for half a century, was dismantled. The Gepids took control of the region, and the other Germanic tribes carved out their own kingdoms. The Huns, defeated and leaderless, tried to re-establish themselves, but they were a spent force. Dengizic, another of Attila's sons, was eventually defeated and killed by the Eastern Romans. His head was sent to Constantinople and displayed in the Hippodrome as a trophy. The once mighty Huns were now hunted, their name now a synonym for defeat, and then they simply vanished. They disappeared from the pages of history as mysteriously as they had arrived. What happened to them? There is no clear answer. Some likely assimilated into other nomadic groups like the Bulgars, who would later emerge from the same region. Others may have migrated further east, their descendants dissolving into the great melting pot of the Eurasian steppes. They left behind no cities, no literature, no monuments. They came like a wind, reaped a harvest of destruction, and then the wind died down, leaving silence. The people who had held half the world in fear exited the stage of history, leaving behind a profound and unsettling question: how could a power so immense simply cease to exist? The Huns were gone, but the world they left behind would never be the same. They were a catalyst, a historical accelerator that sped up processes already in motion and triggered a chain reaction of collapse and creation. Their initial invasion from the east had set off the Great Migration of Peoples, a domino effect that sent Goths, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crashing across the Roman frontiers. This relentless pressure, sustained for nearly a century, mortally wounded the Western Roman Empire. The empire had spent its last reserves of manpower and treasure fighting off Attila. Its provinces were devastated, its government bankrupt, its armies composed largely of unreliable barbarian mercenaries. The center could no longer hold. Just 22 years after the Battle of the Nedao River in the year 476, the last Roman emperor in the West, a young boy ironically named Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. The Western Roman Empire, an institution that had endured for 1,000 years, had officially ceased to exist. It did not die with a bang, but with a whimper, its life force having been drained away by decades of barbarian incursions that all began with the arrival of the Huns. On the ruins of the Roman world, a new Europe began to take shape. The barbarian kingdoms that arose from the chaos would become the ancestors of modern European nations. The Franks in Gaul laid the foundations of France. The Visigoths in Spain and the Ostrogoths in Italy established powerful, if short-lived, kingdoms. The Angles and Saxons, whose own migration to Britain was part of this same cascading movement of peoples, would create England. The entire political and ethnic map of the continent was redrawn. The Huns, in their destructive fury, had inadvertently acted as the violent midwives to the birth of the Middle Ages. They had cleared the ground, demolishing the sclerotic and decaying structures of the late Roman world, leaving a chaotic but fertile space for new societies to grow. 2. The Roman dream of a single, universal empire was dead. In its place was a fragmented continent of competing Germanic kingdoms, a world that would be defined by the fusion of Roman legacy, Germanic warrior culture, and the rising power of the Christian Church, the very institution that had faced down Attila on the banks of the Mincio. The memory of the Huns, and especially of Attila, endured for centuries, becoming a permanent part of the European psyche. They were the ultimate barbarians, the archetypal destroyers. But in the epic poems of the Germanic peoples they had fought and conquered, their image was transformed. In the great German epic, the Nibelungenlied, Attila appears as Etzel, a noble and generous, if fearsome, king. In the Norse sagas, he is Atli, a greedy and cruel monarch. He became a figure of dark legend, a symbol of immense power and savage grandeur, a name to frighten children with for 1,000 years. The Huns themselves may have disappeared, but their ghost has haunted Europe ever since. They remain one of history's greatest enigmas, a people without a past who created a new future, a force of pure destruction that cleared the way for a new creation. They built nothing that lasted, yet the world we inhabit was built on the foundations they unwittingly laid. They were a merciless hurricane that leveled the ancient world. But it was this same hurricane that scoured the landscape, allowing new life to take root in the soil fertilized by the ashes of an empire. Were the Huns a historical dead end, a force of pure nihilism that left nothing but ruins and sorrow in its wake? Or were they the brutal surgeons of history, cutting away a dying civilization so that a new one could be born? Share your verdict in the comments below, for the story of our world is written in the scars they left behind.